On the night of June 15th, 2013, a youth pastor and his two children were driving home after a church party when they stopped to assist a motorist whose vehicle had broken down. The youth pastor, Brian Jennings, left his children in his truck while he, two women who lived nearby, and the driver stood in front of the disabled vehicle. While inspecting the vehicle, suddenly an oversized pickup truck came roaring down the road at 70 miles per hour, even though the speed limit was 45. The driver of the vehicle, Ethan Couch, swerved into the disabled car, then crashed into Pastor Jennings' vehicle, which in turn hit an oncoming Volkswagen Beetle. The truck, operated by Ethan, then went airborne, flipped over, and finally stopped when it struck a tree. Incredibly, the 7 occupants in the vehicle operated by Ethan survived, though one of the persons with him was paralyzed in the accident. The 2 occupants of the Beetle and the 2 children in Pastor Jennings' car also survived with minor injuries. However, all 4 adults who were standing by the disabled vehicle were killed. 3 hours after the accident, Ethan's blood alcohol content was 3 times the legal limit for adult drivers. And he also tested positive for marijuana and Valium. Ethan was arrested and charged with 4 counts of intoxication manslaughter. And prosecutors sought justice for the families of the victims and asked the court to sentence the youth to serve 20 years in prison. However, following a court hearing which was closed to the public, the judge overseeing the case sentenced Ethan to be placed on a 10-year probation after he spent 90 days in a treatment center of his parents' choice. He was sent there so he could learn to be a better person because he suffered from all things being a product of affluenza, which meant that he was unable to link his actions with consequences because his parents taught him that wealth buys privilege. As we turn our focus to the reading in Genesis, perhaps Jacob too was a product of affluenza. Up to this point, Jacob had tricked his older brother Esau into selling his birthright, and he stole his brother's blessing from his elderly blind father who lay on his deathbed. Yet Jacob never suffered any negative consequences for his bad behavior, offering a type of affluenza defense. On the other hand, one could also argue Jacob was a product of bad parenting. After all, it was his mother who had instructed him how to trick his father so he could steal his older brother's blessing, and she was the one who helped him escape his brother's wrath. Fleeing from his parents' house, he showed no remorse for his bad behavior. And who can blame him? Because he clearly suffered no ramifications for his theft and deception as he found sanctuary in his uncle's house. Though we might say he got his just desserts when his uncle conned him into marrying Leah instead of Rachel. However, once again he escaped punishment as he eventually married Rachel as well. So after marrying Rachel, he discovered that his uncle had been manipulating him and stealing money from his accounts, which to me is incredible that Jacob didn't realize this fact earlier, or even recognize that his uncle's actions mirrored his own bad deeds. Apparently, apples don't fall too far from the family trees. Though in Jacob's mind, he believed his actions were justified because he believed he deserved his brother's blessing and birthright. He lived as though the world owed him. So angry at his uncle, he took Rachel, Leah, and his children and fled to the Jabbok River. And while there, he received news that his brother was still full of wrath and was approaching from the other side of the river. Jacob realized he was trapped. He couldn't escape in the opposite direction because that would take him right back to his uncle's house. And he couldn't remain where he was, nor cross the river because Esau was coming in that direction to him. We should note at this point, Jacob still was not feeling any remorse for what he had done to his father or his brother because he felt he was entitled to what he took or stole. Jacob's only concern at this point is he doesn't want to die. This is something Bruce Riley says he can relate to. And he says the reason Jacob lacked feeling remorse for his actions is because he hadn't been broken yet. The reason Mr. Riley, who is the deputy director of VOTE, an organization that advocates for the rights of formerly incarcerated persons, knows about being broken is because he was incarcerated at the age of 19 for murder, and he served a 20-year prison sentence. Mr. Riley said that when he initially arrived in prison, he refused to accept responsibility for his crime, and he blamed everyone else for his actions for which he was being punished. Yet each day in prison became a great weight upon him as he began to wrestle with his conscience. He says an internal or external voice he can't tell, but that voice kept nagging at him and waking him. Then one day he met a fellow prisoner who gave him some helpful advice, saying, "You need to be completely honest with yourself about why you're here. And when you're done grappling, then you'll be free." From that moment, he says, he stopped wrestling with himself and began to spend the majority of his time reading and writing and examining his life through the lens of the passages in the Old and New Testament about owning his mistakes and being forgiven of his sinful past. Upon his release from prison, he entered law school, and though he can't escape his criminal past, which prohibits him from becoming a lawyer, he has devoted his time to speaking with elected officials and attending law reform conferences to talk about how to successfully reintegrate convicts into society, even people like him. But he points out, effective transformation happens when a person hits rock bottom or when they are broken. This was Jacob's experience. He had reached rock bottom while he sat alone along the Jabbok River one night. However, as we know from the passage, he wasn't alone very long when a stranger launched an assault against him. Perhaps the stranger was a mortal being, as Jacob referred to many times while he wrestled. Or perhaps it was God, as Jacob claimed after the wrestling match ended. Though it may be a bit jarring to consider that God was the one who attacked Jacob, on the other hand, it isn't too difficult to imagine God in this way. After all, how many of us have been wakened by God to alter our life's path? Or nudged by God just enough so we stop listening to ourselves and listen to God's voice? Or how many of us have had a sleepless night, struggling to discern God's will? And sometimes those times are initiated by God. Or those times that our experience with God prompted us to try harder or even wrestle with our conscience. From the passage, it's clear that God doesn't sit along the sidelines quietly. It appears that God is a in-our-face kind of God who doesn't accept excuses that our parents made us do it, or that we're a product of affluence, or we can't be bothered by rules or morals because we don't have a conscience. Instead, God confronts us when we are on the wrong path so that our lives are transformed, which is precisely what God did for Jacob. God transformed him physically and transformed him holistically. Jacob was no longer called Jacob, which means deceiver. Instead, he was named Israel, meaning the one who strives with God. Now, it may seem unfair that Jacob was permanently injured, but as one commentary stated, this injury was viewed as a type of badge, a reminder that Jacob had once simply been coasting through life, believing the world owed him everything, and he could do and take what he wanted when he wanted. But transformed by God, this displaced hip served as a constant reminder that it's necessary to wrestle with ourselves and with our conscience, even wrestling with God. Wrestling to be transformed, our sinfulness is purged, and we can receive forgiveness from others and from God. Maybe this is what Paul meant when he wrote to the Philippians to work out your own salvation with fear and with trembling. In this way, it's a reminder that God's gift of grace is free, but it doesn't come cheap. Jacob's displaced hip also serves as a reminder for us that within God's compassion is a tough love component. When we feel tugs on our hearts, or we experience those moments when our conscience is assaulted with guilt pangs or some other feeling that mandates a necessary change in our life, it is then that we learn the hard but necessary way to move towards spiritual maturity. It is these moments of God's nudging and tugging at us that we learn to listen to God's voice. For example, St. Augustine, a 4th century theologian, wrote about his experience when he encountered God. He says he heard God calling in his life, but he initially ignored those calls. But he claims God invaded his senses, so he was transformed from sinner to saint. He writes, God called and shouted and burst my deafness. God flashed, shone, scattered my blindness. God breathed odors, and I drew in breath and panted for God. I tasted and hungered and thirsted. God touched me, and I burned for God's peace. Clearly, God is in the business of transforming lives and does so by utilizing the obstacles we encounter So we move from sinner to saint, from criminal to reformed, freed. Returning to the story of Ethan, the young man who drove impaired. I don't know what will become of his life, but I suspect God isn't done with him yet, just as God isn't complete with any of us either. And I believe transformation may still come into his life just as it does for us when we encounter God. We become a different person, and sometimes even take on a new identity or even a new name. Experiencing the transformation process, we may not like the encounter or how our senses are overwhelmed. And after being broken, our bodies may ache afterward, and we might even come away limping or wounded. But the blessing, as we see with Jacob's wrestling match, is that when we reach rock bottom, or we are broken, by clinging on to God and not letting go, we receive a blessing that makes us stronger or better persons. And then we're able to see the promise of God at work in our lives. As we leave our broken state of being and enter God's holy wholeness, I invite you to join with me in our reading in unison, a litany response. It appears on the back page of the scripture readings and on liturgical screens. You may remain seated as we read aloud Psalm 17 with sentences of prayer following each verse, which is in italics in the PowerPoint. Let us read aloud. Hear a just cause, O Lord. Attend to my cry. Give ear to my prayer from lips free of deceit. I am hurting, O Lord. From you let my vindication come. Let your eyes see the right. Save me, O God. If you try my heart, if you visit me by night, if you test me, you will find no wickedness in me. My mouth does not transgress. Test me, O God. As for what others do, by the word of your lips, have avoided the ways of the violent. Purify me, O Lord. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped. Preserve me, O God. I call upon you, for you will answer me, O God. Incline your ear to me. Hear my words. Hear me, O God. Wondrously show your steadfast love, O Savior of those who seek refuge from their adversaries at your right hand. Show me, O God. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied, beholding your likeness. Satisfy me, O God. Recognizing God's Spirit, which nudges and pulls us, let us recall that God is our shepherd who transforms our lives so we follow God's will through all eternity.